Washington Dulles International Airport, Virginia. March 14, 1973, 11:47 p.m. A canvas travel bag sat alone on the concrete floor of the unclaimed baggage storage facility. Its worn leather handles frayed, its exterior unremarkable except for one detail that would eventually unravel a Soviet intelligence operation spanning 3 continents. The bag had no identification tag, no name, no address, no flight number. It had simply appeared on Carousel 3 after Pan Am Flight 602 from London Heathrow, rotating endlessly while passengers collected their belongings and disappeared into the Virginia night. By the time baggage handler Michael Donnelly noticed it, the carousel had been empty for 20 minutes, and the bag sat there as if waiting for someone who would never come. Donnelly was 42 years old, a veteran of the baggage handling system at Dulles, a man whose entire professional existence revolved around the mundane choreography of moving luggage from aircraft bellies to carousels and back again. He had worked the night shift for 6 years, preferring the quieter hours when the terminal felt less like chaos and more like a machine operating at half speed. He had seen thousands of bags in his career, had developed an almost unconscious ability to assess weight, contents, and owner profile just by lifting a piece of luggage. This bag felt wrong from the moment he grabbed it. Not heavy, but dense. Not expensive, but carefully maintained. And when he checked for identification and found nothing, not even the residue of an old tag, he felt the first stirring of something that wasn't quite suspicion, but wasn't quite routine either. Standard procedure dictated that unclaimed baggage without identification be opened and searched for any means of contacting the owner. Donnelly carried the bag to the small office adjacent to the storage facility, a cramped space with fluorescent lighting that hummed constantly and a metal desk that had seen better decades. He placed the bag on the desk and unzipped it slowly, the sound cutting through the silence of the empty terminal beyond the walls. Inside, wrapped in what appeared to be ordinary clothing, shirts and trousers folded with almost military precision, he found something that made him stop. Photographic film canisters. Not 1 or 2, but 17 of them, each sealed in individual plastic bags. Each wrapped again in bubble wrap, each nestled within the clothing as if the entire bag had been designed specifically to protect these objects. The level of care was extraordinary. The level of care was professional. Donnelly had been a baggage handler long enough to know that people protected what mattered to them. Cameras, jewelry, documents, medications. But this was different. This wasn't a tourist protecting vacation photos. This was someone transporting something that required layers of protection. Someone who understood that film could be damaged by X-rays, by temperature changes, by pressure variations, by careless handling. Someone who knew exactly what they were doing. He stared at the canisters for a long moment, then picked one up. It was room temperature, perfectly sealed, completely anonymous. No labels, no markings. Nothing that would indicate what was inside or who it belonged to. He should have simply logged it as unclaimed property and moved on. He should have filled out Form 647B, noted the contents, and placed the bag in the secure storage area where it would sit for 30 days before being auctioned or destroyed. But something about the precision of the packing, the deliberate anonymity, the complete absence of any identifying information, triggered a response in him that he would later describe to federal investigators as instinct rather than logic. He walked to the phone on the wall and called his supervisor, a man named Robert Kowalski, who had worked at Dulles since the airport opened in 1962 and who had developed his own set of instincts about what was normal and what was not. Kowalski arrived at the office 12 minutes later, still adjusting his tie, his eyes slightly red from the coffee he had been drinking to stay awake during the graveyard shift. He looked at the bag, looked at the film canisters spread across the desk, and made a decision that would later be classified as routine, but would prove to be anything but. He picked up the phone and called airport security. Airport security called the airport police. The airport police called the Federal Bureau of Investigation field office in Washington, and by 2:30 a.m. on March 15, 1973, 3 FBI agents were standing in that small office, staring at 17 film canisters that had been packed with the kind of professional care that suggested something far beyond amateur photography. The lead agent, a man named Thomas Brightwell, had been with the Bureau for 19 years and had spent the last 7 working counterintelligence cases involving Soviet operations in the United States. He lifted one of the canisters, felt its weight, examined the seal, and asked a single question that would define the next 6 months of investigation. Who was on that flight? The answer would take 3 hours to compile. Pan Am Flight 602 had carried 147 passengers from London to Dulles. The manifest listed businessmen, tourists, diplomats, students, journalists, and families. Standard transatlantic traffic for a Wednesday evening in March. But when Brightwell's team cross-referenced the passenger list against known Soviet intelligence personnel, diplomatic personnel, and individuals flagged in previous counterintelligence operations, one name appeared that made the entire room go quiet. Valentin Sokolov, cultural attaché. Soviet Embassy, London, age 38. Listed as traveling on diplomatic documentation. Seated in 14C. No checked baggage listed under his name. But the timing was perfect. The flight had arrived at 11:15 p.m. The bag had appeared on the carousel minutes later. And Sokolov had cleared customs and departed the terminal by 11:40 p.m., 5 minutes before Donnelly noticed the unclaimed bag rotating alone on Carousel 3. The connection was circumstantial but compelling. A Soviet diplomat traveling without checked baggage, and an anonymous bag filled with professionally protected film canisters appearing on the same flight. It was enough to open a case file. It was enough to start asking questions about what was on those films and why someone would go to such lengths to transport them across the Atlantic without any identifying information. What Michael Donnelly had stumbled upon, quite literally by accident, was the tail end of a Soviet intelligence operation that had been running successfully for nearly 2 years, an operation that used commercial airline flights, diplomatic cover, and the assumption that baggage handling was too mundane and too routine to attract serious scrutiny. An operation that relied on the idea that a bag without a name would simply be logged as lost property and eventually destroyed, taking its contents with it into bureaucratic oblivion. But Donnelly had noticed, and Kowalski had called it in. And now, in the early hours of a Thursday morning in March 1973, the FBI was holding 17 film canisters that would, once developed, reveal classified documents from 3 separate NATO installations, photographed with precision and transported with care by someone who had done this before, and who had every reason to believe they would do it again. The Cold War had always been a conflict of small moments and accidental discoveries, of human error and random chance intersecting with institutional paranoia and professional vigilance. This was one of those moments. A baggage handler doing his job, a supervisor making a phone call. And somewhere in the Virginia night, Valentin Sokolov, driving toward the Soviet embassy in Washington, completely unaware that his carefully planned operation had just been compromised by the simplest of mistakes. The kind of mistake that happened thousands of times every day in airports around the world. He had lost his bag, and in losing it, he had lost everything. The films were developed under controlled conditions at FBI headquarters over the next 48 hours. The images were clear, sharp, professional. Schematics for radar installations in West Germany. Communication protocols for NATO naval operations in the North Atlantic. Personnel rosters for intelligence liaison officers stationed in London. Strategic assessments regarding Soviet submarine tracking capabilities. Documents that should never have left their respective facilities, photographed in what appeared to be office settings, late at night, by someone with access and opportunity. The assessment was immediate and unambiguous. This was not a one-time intelligence collection effort. This was systematic. This was ongoing. And this was being executed by someone inside the system, someone with clearance, someone who was either ideologically motivated or financially compromised, or both. Valentin Sokolov became the immediate focus of the investigation, but the reality was more complex than a simple diplomat playing courier. Sokolov was known to the FBI. He had been under light surveillance since his arrival in London 18 months earlier. His movements were documented. His contacts were logged. His behavior was consistent with a cultural attaché doing exactly what cultural attachés did: attending events, meeting with academics, organizing exhibitions, maintaining the carefully constructed facade of diplomatic normalcy that characterized Soviet overseas personnel during the 1970s. He was not a particularly interesting target. He was not someone who triggered active investigation. He was simply another name in a database of Soviet personnel operating in Western capitals, watched but not particularly worried about. But now, with 17 film canisters sitting in an evidence room at FBI headquarters, Sokolov's profile changed completely. The question was not whether he was involved. The question was how deep the operation went, how long it had been running, and who else was part of the network. The FBI opened a formal counterintelligence investigation, codenamed Baggageman, a deliberately mundane designation that reflected the accidental nature of the discovery. The investigation would eventually involve the CIA, the Defense Intelligence Agency, British MI5, and West German BFV. It would span 3 countries, involve surveillance of more than 30 individuals, and ultimately expose a network that had been operating successfully since early 1971. Collecting and transmitting classified information through a method that seemed almost absurdly simple but had proven remarkably effective. The method was this. Documents were photographed at source locations by individuals with legitimate access. The film canisters were then passed through a series of dead drops to a central handler in London, usually within 48 hours of being photographed. The handler, operating under diplomatic cover, would travel on scheduled commercial flights to various cities: Washington, New York, Montreal, using different airlines and different routes to avoid pattern recognition. The film canisters would be placed in anonymous baggage, checked under false names, or simply left unclaimed, timed to be collected by ground personnel at the destination airport who were either witting participants or unwitting accessories to the operation. If the bag was collected successfully, the operation continued. If the bag was lost, it would eventually be destroyed as unclaimed property, and the operation would simply move to the next cycle. It was low-tech, low-risk, and almost invisible to traditional counterintelligence methods that focused on electronic surveillance, human intelligence sources, and pattern analysis of diplomatic movements. The flaw in the system was human. Sokolov had made a mistake. Not a large mistake, not an obvious mistake, but a mistake nonetheless. He had checked the bag but had failed to ensure that the identification tag was properly attached. Whether the tag had fallen off during handling, or whether it had never been properly secured in the first place, was irrelevant. The result was the same: an anonymous bag rotating on a carousel, noticed by a baggage handler who followed procedure and called his supervisor, who made a decision that seemed routine at the time, but would prove catastrophic for everyone involved in the operation. The FBI's approach to Baggageman was methodical and patient. They did not arrest Sokolov immediately. They did not alert the Soviet embassy. They did not shut down the operation. Instead, they watched, they documented, they identified. Over the course of the next 4 months, surveillance teams tracked Sokolov's movements across London, noted his contacts, photographed his meetings, analyzed his patterns. They identified 3 individuals who met with Sokolov with unusual frequency, all of them employed in positions that gave them access to classified materials, all of them showing signs of financial stress or ideological disaffection that made them vulnerable to recruitment. One worked at a NATO logistics facility in Brussels. One worked in the communications division of the U.S. Embassy in London. One worked as a technical contractor for a defense firm in Bonn that specialized in radar systems. Each of them was placed under surveillance. Each of them was investigated quietly, without alerts, without confrontation, without any indication that they had been compromised. The FBI coordinated with Allied intelligence services to build comprehensive profiles. Financial records, travel histories, communication patterns, personal relationships, political affiliations. Anything that might explain how they had been recruited, what they had provided, and what damage had been done. The assessment was sobering. Over a period of approximately 22 months, the network had successfully transmitted an estimated 200 to 300 classified documents to Soviet intelligence, covering operational plans, technical specifications, personnel information, and strategic assessments across multiple domains. The damage was significant. The damage was ongoing. And the damage would have continued indefinitely if Michael Donnelly had not noticed an unclaimed bag on Carousel 3. The decision to move on the network was made in late July 1973, following extensive coordination between U.S. and Allied intelligence agencies. The arrests were simultaneous and coordinated. Sokolov was detained by British authorities as he prepared to board a flight to Moscow, ostensibly for routine consultation at the Soviet Foreign Ministry. The three individuals inside the intelligence network were arrested at their respective locations, each taken into custody without incident, each initially denying any involvement before eventually acknowledging their roles under interrogation. The details of their recruitment varied, but the pattern was consistent. Financial difficulties, access to classified materials, contact with someone who seemed sympathetic and understanding. Small requests at first, payment in cash. Gradually increasing demands. The classic progression of espionage recruitment, executed patiently and professionally by Soviet intelligence personnel who understood exactly how to identify, approach, and exploit vulnerabilities in Western security systems. Sokolov was expelled from the United Kingdom within 72 hours of his detention, declared persona non grata, and placed on a flight to Moscow under escort. He never stood trial. He never faced formal charges. He simply disappeared back into the Soviet system, reassigned to some obscure position within the foreign ministry apparatus. His career effectively ended by a baggage handling error that he probably never fully understood. The three individuals who had provided the documents were prosecuted under espionage statutes, convicted and sentenced to terms ranging from 15 to 25 years in federal prison. Their names were released publicly. Their photographs appeared in newspapers. Their families were destroyed by the revelation of betrayal. And somewhere in the machinery of Western intelligence services, analysts wrote reports assessing the damage, calculating the cost, and recommending changes to security protocols that might prevent similar operations in the future. Michael Donnelly was never publicly acknowledged for his role in breaking the operation. He received a letter from the FBI thanking him for his cooperation and professionalism. He received a small cash payment from the airline for following proper procedures regarding unclaimed baggage. He continued working the night shift at Dulles International Airport, moving luggage from aircraft to carousels and back again. A man whose entire contribution to Cold War counterintelligence consisted of noticing something that seemed wrong and making a phone call. He told very few people about what had happened. He did not consider himself a hero. He considered himself someone who had done his job correctly, which in his mind was simply what anyone should do when confronted with something that did not fit the pattern of normal operations. But in the archives of Cold War intelligence history, in the classified files that document operations, successes, and failures across 4 decades of ideological conflict, baggageman remains a case study in the importance of human observation, institutional procedure, and random chance. It demonstrates that even the most carefully planned intelligence operations can be undone by the smallest errors, by the mundane realities of daily life, by people who are simply paying attention when everyone else has stopped looking. It shows that espionage is not always dramatic confrontations and elaborate schemes, but often the result of someone noticing that a bag has no identification tag and deciding that this matters enough to report it to someone who might care. The Cold War was filled with stories like this, stories that never made headlines. Stories that were classified for decades. Stories about ordinary people encountering extraordinary circumstances and making decisions that had consequences far beyond what they could have imagined. Michael Donnelly was one of those people. And on a night in March 1973, he changed the course of a Soviet intelligence operation simply by doing his job and noticing something that everyone else had missed. The investigation that followed Baggageman's initial breakthrough revealed layers of operational security and tradecraft that surprised even experienced counterintelligence analysts. The Soviet intelligence apparatus had built this network with patience and precision, understanding that the key to long-term success was not audacity, but invisibility. They had chosen their targets carefully, recruited them slowly, and constructed a system that appeared to be nothing more than routine diplomatic travel and ordinary baggage handling. The genius of the operation lay in its mundane nature. There were no clandestine meetings in dark alleys, no secret codes transmitted over shortwave radio, no elaborate brush passes in crowded city squares. Just a diplomat traveling on commercial airlines carrying luggage that looked like everyone else's luggage, moving through systems that processed thousands of bags every day without anyone paying particular attention to any single piece. The three individuals who had been recruited into the network shared certain characteristics that made them vulnerable to Soviet approach and exploitation. None of them were ideologically committed communists. None of them harbored deep resentment toward their own countries or institutions. What they shared was simpler and more common: financial pressure, personal disappointment, and a sense that their contributions were undervalued by the systems they served. The first, a logistics coordinator named David Marsh who worked at the NATO facility in Brussels, had accumulated significant gambling debts over a period of 18 months. He was 41 years old, married with 3 children, and earning a salary that had once seemed adequate but now felt insufficient. Given his financial obligations and his inability to stop placing bets on football matches and horse races, his access to classified logistics information made him valuable. His financial desperation made him accessible. His initial contact with Soviet intelligence came through what appeared to be a chance encounter at a bar near his workplace, a conversation with a man who seemed sympathetic and understanding. Someone who eventually offered to help with a loan that required no paperwork and no formal arrangement. The loan became a debt. The debt became leverage. And within 6 months, David Marsh was photographing documents in empty offices late at night, telling himself that logistics information was not really important, that he was not really betraying anything significant, that he would stop as soon as he cleared his debts and got his life back under control. The second individual, a communications specialist named Linda Fitzgerald who worked at the U.S. Embassy in London, had been passed over for promotion twice in 3 years, despite exemplary performance reviews and clear qualifications for advancement. She was 34 years old, single, dedicated to her work, and increasingly bitter about what she perceived as institutional sexism that favored less qualified male colleagues over competent female professionals. Her access to diplomatic communications and cipher protocols made her extremely valuable. Her resentment made her vulnerable. Her recruitment had been even more subtle than Marsh's, beginning with sympathetic conversations at social events organized by ostensibly independent cultural organizations, discussions about gender equality and professional respect, gradual cultivation of trust and understanding, and eventually a direct approach from someone who framed espionage not as betrayal, but as a form of justice against a system that had failed to recognize her worth. She told herself that she was making a statement. She told herself that the documents she provided were not strategically significant. She told herself that she deserved compensation for years of being undervalued and overlooked. And like Marsh, she believed she would stop when the circumstances changed. When she received the promotion she deserved, when the anger subsided and the need for validation was satisfied. The third individual, a technical contractor named Ernst Weber who worked for a defense firm in Bonn, had no particular financial problems and no obvious grievances against his employer or his country. What he had was a deep fascination with Soviet technical achievements and a growing conviction that Western intelligence agencies were, exaggerating the threat posed by Soviet military capabilities. He was 52 years old, educated, articulate, and convinced that sharing certain technical information with Soviet counterparts was actually a contribution to international understanding and stability rather than espionage. His access to radar system specifications and NATO air defense coordination protocols made him perhaps the most valuable of the three sources. His ideological rationalization made him the most willing to continue providing information over an extended period. His recruitment had been intellectual rather than financial or emotional, beginning with invitations to academic conferences where Soviet scientists presented papers, continuing through correspondence about technical matters that seemed harmless, and eventually evolving into a relationship where he was providing classified information while convincing himself that he was promoting scientific exchange and reducing Cold War tensions through informal cooperation. Each of them had been handled by different Soviet intelligence officers, each operating under separate cover, each maintaining careful separation from the others to ensure that the compromise of one would not automatically expose the rest. But all of their material flowed through Valentin Sokolov, who served as the consolidation point and courier, collecting film canisters from dead drops in London, packaging them carefully in anonymous baggage, and transporting them across the Atlantic on commercial flights that attracted no particular attention from counterintelligence. Services focused on more dramatic indicators of espionage activity. The system had worked flawlessly for nearly 2 years, producing a steady stream of classified information that was analyzed by Soviet intelligence agencies and incorporated into strategic assessments about NATO capabilities, operational plans, and technical developments. The value of this information was difficult to quantify precisely, but CIA analysts who reviewed the compromised documents after the network was rolled up estimated that the Soviets had gained insights equivalent to what they might have obtained through signals intelligence collection over a period of 5 to 7 years. The damage was substantial, the damage was strategic, and the damage would have continued indefinitely if not for a missing identification tag on a canvas travel bag. The interrogations of Marsh, Fitzgerald, and Weber provided detailed information about recruitment methods, handling procedures, and the operational security measures that had kept the network invisible for so long. All three eventually cooperated with investigators, though their motivations for cooperation varied. Marsh seemed genuinely remorseful, repeatedly stating that he had never intended to betray his country and had simply made terrible decisions under financial pressure that had spiraled beyond his control. Fitzgerald was defiant initially, maintaining that her actions were justified by institutional injustice, but eventually acknowledged the severity of what she had done and the damage she had caused. Weber remained convinced that his actions had been misunderstood, that he had been trying to promote peace and understanding, that prosecuting him was itself a tragedy of Cold War paranoia and militarism. The psychological assessments conducted during their prosecution noted that none of them fit the stereotype of the committed ideological spy. They were not deep cover agents. They were not true believers. They were people who had made choices, some under pressure, some out of resentment, some out of misguided conviction, that had led them into relationships with hostile intelligence services and ultimately into betrayal of classified information. The FBI's reconstruction of the network's operational timeline revealed patterns that should have been detected earlier but had been missed because the indicators were too subtle and the methods too unconventional. Sokolov had traveled to the United States 17 times between January 1971 and March 1973. Always on commercial flights, always with legitimate diplomatic justification, always carrying what appeared to be ordinary personal baggage. On at least 12 of those trips, he had transported film canisters containing classified documents, using the baggage system as an anonymous courier service that required no direct contact with agents or handlers on American soil. The bags were sometimes checked under his name, sometimes checked under false names, sometimes simply left unclaimed if he sensed that surveillance was too close or security was too tight, The flexibility of the system was its strength. If a bag was intercepted or lost, it was simply anonymous property with no clear connection to Soviet intelligence. If a bag was collected successfully, the operation continued. The risk to Sokolov personally was minimal. The risk to the sources providing documents was minimal, and the likelihood of detection was calculated to be extremely low because counterintelligence agencies were focused on traditional espionage methods rather than commercial airline baggage systems. What changed everything was not sophisticated surveillance or breakthrough intelligence analysis, but human attention to procedural detail. Michael Donnelly had noticed an anomaly. Robert Kowalski had recognized that the anomaly was worth reporting. The FBI had responded with appropriate suspicion and professional investigation, and the entire network had collapsed, not because of any dramatic counterintelligence operation, but because someone had noticed that a bag had no identification tag and had followed standard procedures for handling such situations. The lesson was clear and had been reinforced repeatedly. Throughout the history of intelligence and counterintelligence operations during the Cold War, systems are only as secure as their smallest components. Operations are only as invisible as their most visible mistake. And even the most carefully planned espionage network can be undone by something as simple as a missing luggage tag and a baggage handler who pays attention to his work. The broader implications of baggagemen extended beyond the immediate arrests and prosecutions. The case prompted comprehensive reviews of security procedures at airports, embassies, and classified facilities across the United States and allied nations. New protocols were implemented for tracking diplomatic baggage. Enhanced screening procedures were introduced for personnel with access to classified materials. Counterintelligence training was updated to emphasize that espionage often occurred through mundane methods rather than dramatic operations, and that vigilance required attention to routine anomalies rather than just obvious threats. The case became required study material at FBI and CIA training facilities, used to demonstrate the importance of procedural compliance, attention to detail, and the willingness to report anomalies even when they seemed insignificant. Michael Donnelly's decision to call his supervisor about an unclaimed bag became a teaching example of how ordinary employees, performing ordinary duties, could contribute to national security simply by doing their jobs correctly and reporting things that seemed wrong. For Valentin Sokolov, the consequences of the operation's failure were immediate and severe, though they played out largely beyond Western observation. He returned to Moscow in disgrace, his diplomatic career effectively ended. His reputation within Soviet intelligence circles destroyed by what was perceived as an unforgivable operational error. The fact that the error had been relatively minor, a missing identification tag, did not mitigate the judgment against him. In the unforgiving culture of Soviet intelligence services during the 1970s, success was expected and failure was punished regardless of the circumstances that had caused it. Sokolov was reassigned to a meaningless administrative position within the Foreign Ministry, stripped of his operational responsibilities, and effectively exiled to professional obscurity. He would spend the remainder of his career processing paperwork and attending meetings where his input was neither requested nor valued. A cautionary example of what happened when operational security failed and networks were compromised. His name appeared in Western intelligence reports for several years after the baggageman arrests, always in the context of failed operations and compromised networks. A reminder that even experienced intelligence officers could make mistakes that had catastrophic consequences. The three individuals who had provided classified information to Soviet intelligence faced very different fates. David Marsh was sentenced to 18 years in federal prison, his financial problems rendered irrelevant by his conviction, his family destroyed by the publicity surrounding his arrest and trial, his name permanently associated with betrayal and espionage. He served 14 years before being released on parole, emerging into a world that had moved on without him. Finding work in low-level clerical positions that required no security clearance and no trust. Living quietly in a small apartment and maintaining minimal contact with the family that had largely disowned him after his conviction. Linda Fitzgerald received a sentence of 22 years, reflecting the court's assessment that her access to diplomatic communications had made her particularly valuable to hostile intelligence services and that her betrayal had been especially damaging to national security. She served 17 years before parole, using her time in prison to earn a graduate degree through correspondence programs, and eventually finding work with a nonprofit organization that advocated for prison reform and re-entry programs for convicted criminals. Ernst Weber received the longest sentence, 25 years, because of the technical nature of the information he had provided and his continued insistence during trial that he had done nothing wrong, which the court interpreted as lack of remorse and continued danger to national security. He served 19 years before being released, returning to Germany where he lived in relative obscurity, occasionally writing letters to newspapers about Cold War history and his conviction that prosecuting technical exchanges between scientists was itself a form of intellectual oppression. None of them ever fully escaped the consequences of their decisions. The convictions followed them through employment applications, housing rentals, social relationships, and every interaction with institutions that required background checks or security clearances. They lived the remainder of their lives marked by their past actions, known primarily as people who had betrayed classified information. Reduced to footnotes in Cold War espionage history, remembered not for who they had been before their recruitment, but for what they had done after. The tragedy of their stories was not that they had been caught, but that they had been recruited in the first place. That they had made choices that seemed manageable at the time, but had accumulated into catastrophic betrayals. That they had convinced themselves through various rationalizations that what they were doing was not really espionage, or was somehow justified by circumstances, or was not as serious as it actually was. And by the time they understood the full magnitude of what they had done, they were already too deeply involved to extract themselves without facing consequences that seemed even worse than continuing. The classified assessments produced by U.S. and Allied intelligence agencies in the aftermath of Bagageman's conclusion emphasized several key findings that would influence counterintelligence practice for decades afterward. First, that espionage networks did not always rely on sophisticated technology or elaborate tradecraft, but often succeeded through simple methods that exploited routine procedures and institutional assumptions. Second, that recruitment of sources often targeted personal vulnerabilities rather than ideological commitment, meaning that counterintelligence efforts needed to focus on identifying and addressing financial problems, career dissatisfaction, and personal grievances among personnel with security clearances. Third, that detection of espionage activity often depended on frontline employees who noticed anomalies and reported them through proper channels, making training and awareness programs for non-intelligence personnel a critical component of security infrastructure. And fourth, that operational security failures often resulted from small mistakes rather than dramatic breaches, reinforcing the need for attention to detail and procedural compliance at every level of operations. The case also generated extensive discussion within intelligence communities about the nature of courier operations and the vulnerabilities inherent in diplomatic travel. Soviet intelligence services had long used diplomatic cover to facilitate espionage operations, knowing that diplomatic immunity provided protection against arrest and prosecution in most circumstances. What Bagageman demonstrated was that even when diplomatic personnel were under surveillance, they could still execute effective courier operations by using systems that were too routine and too high volume to monitor comprehensively. Airport baggage systems processed millions of bags every year. Customs inspections focused on contraband and dangerous materials rather than photographic film. And the assumption that diplomatic travelers would be carrying personal belongings rather than intelligence material meant that baggage often received less scrutiny than the diplomats themselves. The operational lesson was clear. Routine systems could be exploited for intelligence purposes if the exploitation was sufficiently mundane and sufficiently patient. And the counter lesson was equally clear. Security required vigilance at every level, not just at the points where espionage was expected to occur. Michael Donnelly continued working at Dulles International Airport for another 12 years after the baggageman case, retiring in 1985 at the age of 54 with a pension and a reputation among his colleagues as someone who was thorough and professional and who never cut corners even when cutting corners would have been easier. He never sought publicity for his role in breaking the espionage network. He never gave interviews to journalists or intelligence historians. He never wrote a memoir or participated in documentaries about Cold War espionage. When asked about it by colleagues who had heard rumors, he would simply say that he had noticed something unusual and had reported it according to procedure, which in his view was exactly what anyone should do in similar circumstances. He did not consider himself exceptional. He considered himself someone who had done his job correctly, and in his understanding of the world, doing one's job correctly was not heroic but simply expected. But in the quiet calculations of intelligence agencies assessing sources and methods, successes and failures, Michael Donnelly represented something important about how security actually functions in practice. Not through dramatic interventions or brilliant analysis, but through ordinary people paying attention to details that seem insignificant at the time but prove crucial in retrospect. His observation of an unclaimed bag had led to arrests, prosecutions, and the dismantling of a network that had been successfully collecting classified information for nearly 2 years. His phone call to a supervisor had triggered an investigation that spanned 3 countries and involved multiple intelligence agencies. His adherence to standard procedures had demonstrated that security systems work when people follow them, even when those procedures seem tedious or unnecessary. Even when it would be easier to simply log something as lost property and move on to the next task. The baggageman. Case closed officially in 1976 after all appeals had been exhausted and all 3 convicted individuals had begun serving their sentences. The classified files were sealed, marked for review after 25 years, and stored in secure facilities where they would remain until declassification processes eventually released. Portions of the documentation to researchers and historians studying Cold War intelligence operations. Valentin Sokolov's name appeared occasionally in subsequent intelligence reports, always in historical context, always as an example of failed operations and compromised networks. The 3 individuals he had handled lived out their sentences and their post-prison lives in varying degrees of obscurity and regret. And Michael Donnelly retired from baggage handling, his contribution to Cold War counterintelligence known to very few people outside classified circles. His legacy preserved in training materials and case studies that taught new generations of intelligence professionals that vigilance matters, that procedures exist for reasons, and that sometimes the smallest observations lead to the most significant outcomes. If stories like this make you rethink how close the world came to losing itself through accumulated small betrayals and quiet compromises, consider what it means that security often depends not on dramatic heroism, but on ordinary people doing ordinary work with attention and care. These are not just stories about espionage and counterintelligence. They are stories about the fragility of systems, the importance of procedure, the consequences of small decisions, and the reality that history is shaped as much by chance and routine as by grand strategies and bold actions. The Cold War was filled with such moments. Moments when everything hung on whether someone noticed something wrong and whether they cared enough to report it. Baggage Man was one of those moments. And it began with a baggage handler noticing that a bag had no identification tag.